All right, so let's get to the three stages of manufacturing. We have apprentices, we have journeymen, and we have masters. All right, and then you see that Super Mario looking cobbler working at a barrel. All right, so tradition held that each artisan should have the opportunity to pass through all three stages during his productive life. So basically, the master was, the master craftsman, the king of his trade. The journeyman was someone who knew as much as the master, but did not have enough money to open up his own storefront yet. The apprentice was someone who signed a contract to work work for the master for 4 to 7 years, while being sort of a servant, but also the master would be obligated to train the apprentice. And the idea was eventually you go from being an apprentice to being a journeyman to being a master with your own storefront. We'll go more into it in a moment, but that's the overall gist. And it worked. All right, if you signed an indentured contract to be an apprentice, it was in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. That promise held true. You got that storefront, basically. So there were 3 levels. If you look at the notes, the master was self-employed. They owned their own shops. The storefront was often part of the home. And the master was in charge of the education of young men through the apprenticeship system until they equaled the master, until the apprentice equaled the master. So let's move on. The apprenticeship. Apprenticeship began in early teens and provided essential training for an individual's specialty. A fee had to be paid by the apprentice or by the apprentice's parents for entering an apprenticeship, and an ironclad legal contract bound the apprentice to his master for a specified period of time. Tradition attempted to ensure fair treatment for the apprentice. The master was required to feed and house him and provide necessary level of training for participation eventually in the trade. Looking at the notes, the apprentice lived with the master in a paternal relationship. It was kind of like father and son, like family, but it was also an indentured contract with obligations on both sides. It was a legal contract because the apprentice was often too young, so a guardian had to sign. Some things were standard, like in every contract. Moral limits: they couldn't drink or gamble or marry or date, yada yada. Things that were variable: how much money they may have gotten paid, or how much money it cost, or how much at the end they got. What clothing was provided for them, and the level of schooling outside the training that was provided for them. All right, so once you graduate from your apprenticeship, which again, remember, was more familial than, say, employer and employee. All right, you may get a set of tools from the master craftsman, or you may get some type of monetary payment to get a pair of tools, but you got that all-important pair of tools, and you became a journeyman. All right, so the apprentice usually became a journeyman after training was completed. You would work for wages, and those wages were often supplemented by food and housing provided by the master. After an appropriate number of years, during which the journeyman was supposed to save money, presumably to buy or inherit a shop and equipment, and eventually become a master. Now, artisans had a social and economic ladder that they climbed as they gained skill and capital, investment cash. Let's look at the notes. So the journeyman worked for the master for 1 or more years, gaining experience, saving capital, so they can open their own shop, storefront right in front of their house or below it, and so forth. And they would get skill along the way. You can, as long as you have your own tools, you can move from employer to employer at will. The tools were your machinery, and therefore you had power over your own labor. That's important. So the journeyman still had it. But they didn't have the raw materials and the workspace of the storefront. The master craftsman provided that. And the master craftsman paid a price per product that corresponded to the kind of price that the good would sell for. You did custom order work. So the customer would come in, say what he or she wanted, and you would do it. And you would negotiate a price. And as a journeyman, you would get part of that price. Basically, the master craftsman would take a cut that, for the most part, was how much it cost for the expenses of the storefront and the materials. Women were involved in production only where they worked for a husband or a father, normally sewing, hat, shoes, etc. The master craftsman or the journeyman's wife or daughter were not paid directly, but it was always in a familial context, family-like context. All right? But remember, women's labor was always under the paternal authority of the family government. All right, urban artisans. This is more about urban artisans in general. So prior to the market revolution, most manufacturing was done by urban artisans. They were skilled craftsmen who lived in cities. They worked with simple tools, and they worked in their homes or in small shops. Apprentices performed menial work, the drudgery tasks that the journeyman or the master craftsman didn't want to do. All right, things they didn't need training for. Most of the rest of the work was done by the artisan himself. Things that you had to have training to do. Things for which real skill was required. All right, looking at the notes here. This is very important. These are pre-industrial values I'm going to be describing here underneath this slide. Male artisans controlled their own time. They were autonomous. There was no wall between free time and leisure time. Those concepts did not exist in people's minds. The normal workday was from sunup to sundown. It was a leisurely workday. There were no clocks to stare at. They took breaks, they fished, they drank. All that mattered was that you finished the product and you finished it well. And they were proud of their work. Now again, I don't want to make this sound like all rainbows and unicorns. They worked hard, but they loved it. Remember, they saw part of themselves in the finished product. They were not alienated from the product. To be alienated from the product means you feel alien to, separated from the product. They saw themselves in the finished product. So they were independent free men in a Republican sense. They were the manufacturing version of Jefferson's vision. They were often organized in what was called mechanics associations. They took pride in using their heads and their hands, in being useful to society. They would often have parades, and they expected and received status. They felt their crafts helped the nation and its independent status from nations like France and England. If we make the stuff, we don't depend on France or England. They saw themselves as continuing independence, and they advocated the labor theory of value, arguing that labor is the source of surplus value, the profit. So the hunk of wood isn't going to bring you much value, but you change that wood into a barrel or a bookcase. Who added that value? The artisan. That's the labor theory of value. Therefore, labor should be rewarded in their mind with the profit above the cost of materials. Now, don't forget, it was a familial atmosphere. Family life and work were intertwined. There was no wall in between in their minds. Wives sometimes helped with work. They kept accounts. They sold finished products. The family lived in the shop, either in a back room or in the attic. In a subsequent video quiz, we're going to close read these workplaces, and we'll see that. Masters often housed and fed the journeymen and apprentices. It created a large extended family. There was little life outside this extended family. Moving on. All right, the artisan work culture. Artisans, armed with a skill, were accustomed to control of their work conditions, including the hours worked and the pace. Please label that pre-industrial values. That's what those are. And that's what clashed with industrial values. You're expected to obey the clock. So artisans routinely mixed recreation and labor together. All right. They may have a quota of a certain number of rifles a month. If they meet that quota in a week, guess what? You're off for 3 weeks the rest of the month. All right. Now we get to guilds, the last thing we're going to talk about. Guilds are kind of like a forerunner of unions, except that in guilds, everybody has the same interest. Apprentice, journeyman, and master craftsman. And that interest is to ensure that their trade, whether it be a cobbler making barrels, a milliner making hats, whatever it is, that the trade prospers. All right, when we eventually transition to employee-employer, and they become unions, that will be different because they will have opposite interests, the workers and the owners, who used to be master craftsmen and journeymen/apprentices with the same interests, are now will become unions with opposite interests from each other. All right, so each urban trade had its guild, and most guilds had the legal power to deny a worker the right to practice a trade unless he was a member of the organization. It was meant to protect the trade. Guilds existed to protect the standard of living and economic opportunities of its members, like a mechanics association we talked about. Now, the goal of it was not to maximize production, as you will see among the owners in factories. as well as to provide what we call today benefits. They wanted to provide benefits to the artisans, sick pay, funeral pay, things like that. All right, but it's important to remember they all had the same interests, and the guild existed. They limited who could be in that particular trade to ensure the success of that trade. All right, so be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.